Hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th video of the series of using Power Apps and Flow for business processes. And in today's session we're going to look at the formulas and the controls that are necessary to create that dynamic form and to give you the functionality that we've been demoing. Thank you very much for your feedback. I really appreciate it. If you haven't watched the previous videos, it might be a good idea to do so, just to give you a little bit more background, and we hope you enjoyed today's video. So let's have a look at the screens that the app consists of. First screen is the welcome screen, and in this example it's basically just a big gallery that shows all of the records that have been submitted into the process. You can also create more of a soft landing for the users with pretty pictures and these sort of things before you take them into the gallery screen, really depending on your application. This next screen is the data screen, and this is where most of the magic happens, and I think this is probably the biggest benefit of using this method of doing the business process. Is you only have one data screen, and that caters for all of the steps in the business process. So even if your process consists of 30 or 40 workflow steps, you'd only still have one data screen, and this data screen would then behave according to the relevant step in the process. Workflow detail screen is what we use to display the workflow history, as well as give the user a bit of a progress bar for them to understand where they are in the process, what still has to happen, what has happened already, just to give them a little bit of more context as to what this process is all about. Then submission confirmation screen is just confirming to the user that something or that the submission has gone through, and we can give them things like reference numbers and support contact details, these sort of things on this screen as well. The administration screen is what we use for maintaining the application. So we don't want to release a new version of the Power App every time something changes in the config, as an example. So let's say that there's a new branch in the organization. You typically want a place for people to go and administer this app and add these lookups and keywords dynamically so that you don't have to amend the design. So at the moment there's nothing in here. We only have an override button, a game controller at the bottom that'll give the administrator overriding access excuse me, to all of the steps in the workflow process to allow him or her to override fields regardless of whether they're locked or hidden, depending on the step in the process. Then the last screen is the template screen, and this you can typically use to pre-set up the formatting on all of your controls, and then as you populate the app you can just copy and paste these to the data screens, and then you don't have to do the styling on each of these. So yeah, this is pretty handy, and you can also then link the controls to these to have the control inherit the fill of this block, for an example, and that'll automatically do the styling throughout. So if I have a look at the header and the fill, you'll see this refers to CFG for config, and then fill main.fill. So this control is called fill main, and then we're telling the header to inherit from this or from these blocks. So then certain parts of the app you can then inherit certain colors for. So it's nothing really to do with the business process, it's just the way that we prefer to do the styling, so that we don't end up hard coding all of the colors and font sizes and these sort of things in the application. Right, so jumping into the formulas, the first formula we need to have a look at is the onStart trigger. And the onStart only runs when the app launches, and it is only available on the first screen in the app. So what we use it for is to populate certain variables. So we're going to set a variable for the user ID, for a SharePoint library URL, for the business process key that Power Apps uses to interact with the flow runs in order to tell it which business process this is actually referring to. And in this case we're also setting the admin users, and this is basically what we use to then hide or show the administration gear at the bottom of the screen. Then under clear collect, or then we use clear collect to go and fetch the business profile, and this is what we did previously, to connect to the custom connector to fetch the business profile for onboarding 001, and then we take whatever this returns and write it into this collection. And you can call these collections whatever you like. In this case, we're calling it AWFM and workflow, and that's what contains the entire workflow process, and the entire flow object that you created earlier will be written into this collection. Then we're taking that same collection and we're then basically getting the process steps, and we write that into the AWFM workflow steps collection to make it easily accessible at some stage or during the app. Then we're deep linking from email notifications. So remember that the onStart triggers when the app launches. So this checks if the app is being launched from a link in an email that was generated by the workflow. And the code or the formula then basically redirects the user to the specific record that generated the notification. So I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but essentially that's what we're doing on the onStart as well. And we'll create another blog about that. Alright, so on the welcome screen we've got the gallery that we need to display the information on. And in this example, it's got a very basic formula for items, and it's just basically sorting the data list in SharePoint according to the ID. So none of these filters at the top are currently hooked up, as you can see in this formula, but we'll get to that during a later video or a later session. But essentially, this is just displaying the data in that SharePoint list that we store the data in. And then for these labels where we need information from the workflow history, we are just filtering the workflow history list in SharePoint according to this ID and making sure that that's the same as the record ID as specified in the workflow history. And then we're fetching the last record from that set, and then we're fetching the responsible person. So whatever was written into the last record in the workflow history, it'll take the responsible person from that record and display it in this value. The same with the status. So we'll cover this in a little bit more detail later, but in its most basic form, that's what this gallery does in order to display the information. Right, so now we're going to look at creating a new record, and if we click on the plus sign at the top of the screen, you'll see that all of these controls knew what to do based on the first step of the workflow process. So we're basically going to have a look at what the formula behind this plus sign does. And if we expand that, you'll see that first we're setting up a few variables, and it's important to understand that this data screen has zero context on the data or the workflow history or the business process profile which you defined in Flow. So you need to set up all of these parameters before you call the data screen in order for that screen to understand what to display, what to lock, and what to display as being mandatory. So if we go and have a look, first of all, we're setting a variable to tell it that it's needs to be in edit mode. So obviously if you create a new record off the bat, it needs to be in edit mode. You shouldn't have to click on edit. So we're doing that. We're telling it that it's a new screen, and that'll trigger all of the defaults on all of the controls to not try and retrieve the data from the workflow, or sorry, from the data list, but to actually just display the blank or the default values. Then we're setting the form record to blank. We'll explain that a little bit better later. And then we're overriding the admin override variable that might have been set on the admin screen, where there's that little game controller that allows the administrator to override locked and hidden fields. But obviously in the context of the first step, it doesn't make sense. You know, so you're not going to override anything on the first step, and this basically just resets that. Then we're clearing any workflow history that might have been somehow left in that collection. So we definitely don't want to display workflow history from other records that we worked with in the new record that we're showing. Right, then we're going to fetch the properties from the first step. So we're setting the current record step collection by fetching the first value or the first entry in this collection, which we defined in the app application on start event. So this basically contains all of the process steps, all of the metadata that needs to be shown and hidden and locked, and all of the rules around that. And we're just saying, well, fetch the first one of that collection, which is essentially the first step, and make this the current record step. And that's how we're going to easily interact with that data on the data form. Right, then we're going to just set the current record step ID as well. It's sometimes useful to just have that available if you need to. Right, then we're setting the available options for the relevant step. So we're using a clear collect, and we're using the current record step collection, which we defined previously, and we're now doing a new collection called current record options. And then it's easy to just tell the radio control or the drop down or the gallery or whatever it is that you choose to use for the user to pick one of these options. It's easy to tell that what the options are by just pointing it to this collection. Right, then we're setting the step name and the responsible person. You don't have to do this over here. You can, in the data form, go and extract that information, but we find that it's sometimes easy if you just have that available. You don't have to go and fetch that from the current record step. And then the current record responsible person is obviously the person who's clicking on this button, and it's very easy just to do that. And then we're good to go, and then we do the navigation to the data screen, and that's the effect that you get over here. So let's run this, and there is our data screen all set up and ready to go. Alright, so now that we're in the data screen, let's go and have a look at the elements that make up the header and the information on the screen. So first of all, we've got the header section, and basically the first item we're looking at, the workflow status. So this is how you tell the user in what current step the process is, and we're basically connecting to the current record step collection, and we're fetching the step name from that, and whatever the step is in the specific process, it'll then just change automatically, so you don't again have to create multiple screens and all of those sort of ugly things. Same with the role, simply connecting to that current record step collection and fetching the responsible role. Exactly the same with the workflow phase or stage. So you'll see in the JSON we called it stage, in the label we're calling it phase, so it doesn't really matter. But the idea with a phase is that you can have multiple workflow steps in one workflow phase. So, and this touches on reporting and these sort of things, and it's really up to your preference if you have a step and a phase, and whether you call it a phase or a stage, it's really up to you. But then here's the instruction that we want to present to the user, and you'll see all of these formulas are very simple. There's actually nothing else happening here. We're just connecting to the collection and finding the step instructions and displaying that to the user according to your business profile process. Then the responsible person field or label is displaying the variable that we set to the current record responsible person earlier when we launched the form. So right now it'll always be the person who created the form in the first step, but when you start opening up existing records, then you need to do a little bit more preparation before you go into the data screen to make sure that you set this variable to the correct value. Alright, so moving on to the data and the controls that we use to display and populate the data. We need to first show you an Excel spreadsheet that we've created that makes creating of these formulas a lot quicker, because you don't want to be typing a formula like this manually for each one of the controls. So what we've done is we created a spreadsheet that you type in the field names as per your spreadsheet, as per your data source, and then it doesn't matter whether you use SQL or SharePoint lists or Excel, it really doesn't matter. You go and specify your field or your column name in the data source, and then from here it'll tell you this is what the label or the name that you should use for the label, this is the label or the name that you should use for the input field, as well as the formulas for the visible property, the display mode, and the mandatory property, which in our case, in this current example, we're using the border color to basically show the user that something is mandatory. It also generates the default property for you automatically, as well as the patch. So it's then very easy to just copy and paste these into PowerApps. So if we open up PowerApps and we go and have a look at the display mode property, you'll see that this formula, I can copy and paste the display mode formula, paste it in there, and it'll just automatically light up this control correctly. So it throws away the formatting. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find a way to add new rows in Excel. The moment you do that, then it adds quotes in all the wrong places and etc. So at the moment, the Excel spreadsheet just has everything in one line, but it works perfectly. And you never really need to read this formula. Essentially, all that you do is you go copy visible property code formula and paste that in here, and it'll light up automatically. And this automatically connects the control to your business process profile as well as to the data in the data source. So if you have a look at things like the default, I can just simply go and paste this in default, and then it just works automatically just out of the box. You don't need to customize this any further. So this makes it very quick to create data on the form, create these controls, input controls, and putting the formulas in the necessary properties, and that'll automatically light up the form correctly. So moving back into the form, before we jump into the formulas, we just need to discuss the control that we're using to display the options for the current workflow step. And for this example, we're using a gallery because it allows more options for styling it and playing around and doing some nice things with it. But you could also use a radio control or a drop down. It works exactly the same from a formula perspective. We just found the gallery to be more visually appealing. All that you need to do is have the items point to the current record options collection that we created at the time of generating the new form, and then just telling it that it should display the option name column from this collection, and essentially you're good to go. So looking at these formulas in a little bit more detail, let's start with the default formula. It's pretty simple, and it just basically says if the form underscore new variable is true, then make this control blank. If it isn't, and in other words, if it is an existing record that has been saved, connect to the form underscore record variable and fetch the title column. And so this variable we set on the select on the welcome gallery. So as soon as you open an existing record, then we write that record into this variable, and then it's very easy to interact with it. Now let's have a look at the visible property in a little bit more detail. And as I mentioned, it is quite messy because Excel puts everything in one line. So I just might clean this up a little bit so that it's easier to read and easier to explain. So let's just do that for now. Alright, so first of all, if it's the admin override is true, then it should be visible. It's easy as that. Then we're checking for the title in the visible fields column of the current record step collection, as well as in the editable field. So if it's found in any of these two columns in that collection, which ultimately is populated by your JSON profile, then it should be visible. And then we have another condition that says if it's in edit mode, then go and check if there's an option selected, and if there is, then go and check if the option visible fields contains the title in the value, or the option editable fields contains the title in the value column. So that enables you to display or make certain fields available only when you select a specific option in a workflow step as well, which is quite cool, where you can have on reject or decline steps where you want to ask the user why you're declining it or why you're rejecting it. You can then open up that field the moment that the user selects a specific option, and not when they enter the step already. Right, so let's move on to the display mode property, and First of all, it needs to see if the form underscore edit variable is true. And if it's not, then obviously don't make it editable. But if it is, then it needs to check, can it find title in editable fields for the current record step collection? And or it needs to check if it, once again, make sure that if there's, or see if there's an option selected, and if there is, it needs to see if it can find title in the value for the option editable fields in the workflow options collection. Or it needs to check if the admin override is true, and if it is any of these things, then it should display it in edit mode. Otherwise, it should just display it in view mode. Right, so now we're going to look at showing the user which fields are mandatory. And in this example, using border color, you can also use fill. There are many different options for this. But in essence, what we're doing is we're checking if the form is in edit mode, and if it is, and the title is blank, then go and see if you can find the title in the mandatory fields for the current record step, as well as in the value column of the current selected workflow option under mandatory fields. So by doing this, if one of these two returns true, then it's going to turn this red, otherwise it's going to keep it to the default color. And you can also then play around and hook these up to, or these colors up to your template controls on the template screen to make it even more dynamic. But essentially what this is going to do, if I select this option, it's going to mark all of the fields that are mandatory, and as I complete these, you'll see that it turns them back to the default color. And we're now essentially ready to submit this into the workflow. But before we do, I'm just going to make that blank, and the moment that I submit this, it's going to create a message box to tell me that the job title cannot be blank, and all of this is now governed in the submit control, which we'll be discussing now. So I'm going to take a deep breath and then jump into the submit button, or the submit icon. There's quite a lot happening in that formula, and which is a good and a bad thing. You know, I think it would be nice to strip even more of that logic out of PowerApps and put it into the JSON profile. But unfortunately, we can't pass formula to PowerApps through JSON yet. So we have to, unfortunately, create the formulas to do things like field validations and so on and so forth. And then just off the cuff, I'm going to put this into Visual Studio Code because it is too much to read in PowerApps. Right, so first of all, if we start at the top, we set the context variable submit in progress to true, and that just disables that icon so that the user doesn't accidentally double click on it and then it issues two of these instructions or two of these commands, which might be an issue. So we disable the button as soon as the user clicks on it. Then we go in and make sure that the user has an option selected, and if so, we'll trigger the switch statement that does the validations on the fields. If it's not selected, if an option isn't selected, then we'll collect runtime messages, and this is a normal collection, and we'll pass these values to it, and that'll generate a generic message box in the app. So we have all of our error messages or warnings, and all of these things are using the same message box, and that's a discussion for another blog. We'll point you to that in the comment section, but essentially this will show you, or this will give the user a pop-up to tell them that they have to select a workflow option. So if there is an option selected, we're running the following switch statement, and we're combining the current record step ID and the option that is selected, and that allows us to test for a few values. So we're saying that if it's in step 1 and it's being submitted, then go and check and make sure that the text value.text isn't blank, and if it is blank, return this message to the message box. And so we can then run through all of the validation that we want to do before allowing the submit to go through. Alright, so this is on the submit. You'll see that's on step 2 when it's approved, or step 2 if the user requests information, step 2 being rejected, and so on and so forth. So this is quite a complex formula, but The nice thing about this is if you want to change logic in the app, then you go to one place. You essentially open up this submit icon, and then you have all of the rules for all of the submission steps in one place. You don't have to jump around and wonder where things are being validated. First prize would be if we can get formula passed from the flow run to PowerApps in a way that PowerApps can then evaluate that. But unfortunately, we're not aware of a way to do that at the moment. Right, so after we've done the switch statement, then we are checking if there are any errors on the screen. And if so, then cancel it, don't do anything. If there aren't errors on the screen, in other words, aren't validations that failed, then we'll go ahead and issue a patch on the data source. So then we're running through and we're saying that, first of all, if is empty runtime messages, which is a collection, then we update the context variable to true again. In other words, we're saying the submission will now continue, otherwise it'll just do nothing. Right, so here we're saying if the form is new, then set the form record, so this is a variable, with the return that it gets after issuing this patch. So if you create a new record through a patch, the return for that command is a handle on the actual record that it created. So this writes that into the form underscore record variable for if it's a new record that hasn't previously been saved. And we need to test whether it's previously saved because of this section over here. You'll see that we're telling it that the ID is blank in the patch command in the second parameter, which tells patch to create a new value. You'll see in the second section of the if statement we have a very similar patch, but the only difference is the second variable is the actual form record, and we're not telling it to create a new one by specifying the ID to be blank. Alright, so there we're passing it the field and value pairs. So it's telling it that the title should in the data source should be set to the title underscore value dot text from the control. So if we open up that Excel spreadsheet, you'll see that the patch column actually gives you the field and value pairs. So if you select all of these and paste it into your formula, that'll actually populate it 99% correct. You might have to fix one or two things depending on the control type or the data type, but in essence this works very well. Or if you're really brave, you can just type all of this out manually. But essentially this is the creating a new record on the first part of the if, and then the second part is updating an existing record. And over here we're passing it the form underscore record. So we're saying that if it is an existing record, we would have initiated this variable from the welcome gallery where we clicked on the record, and then we're just passing patch this record and then passing it the field and value pairs that it needs to do in the patch. Alright, so that takes care of writing all the data into your data SharePoint list. And you can also, if you do any validations on the SharePoint list or in the data source, you will just need to have an if statement over here to go and check for errors on the data source before you continue. In this example, we're not doing any back-end validation on the data source. Alright, so next we're now going to submit the workflow step. And what this does is actually just writes a new row into the workflow history, and our flow is set up to listen on that workflow history and trigger as soon as a new row is added. So all that we have to do is to write a normal patch. It'll always be a new record, so we'll also always specify ID blank in order for this patch command to generate a new workflow history. And then this is the data that we're writing to the workflow history in order to create our history entry, but then also act as an instruction for flow to go and execute. So we've got the submission date, and then we're passing it the current date. You can also, depending on your time zone, you can use the date add in order to manipulate and make up for time zone differences and these sort of things. So then we're passing the record ID, so the form record.id whether it's a new one or an existing one. We'll have that populated by this time we get to this area of the formula, and then we're just writing that in the record ID column in the workflow history. And that's the only thing that links the data record to the workflow history records, is the record ID column. So then we processing or writing the process key. In other words, in this case, the staff onboarding process key that tells Flow which process we're working with. So we've set that on the onStart event on the first welcome screen of this app, and we're now just writing that in the history as well. Right, so then we're person column, we're writing the current user's ID, and this is also a variable that we set on the onStart. If you didn't set it in the onStart, then over here you'll just specify the user, open bracket, close bracket, .email. Then we need to pass it the process stage, so we connect to the current record step, and we fetch the first value or the first record, and then we write and we fetch the process stage, and we write that into the process stage column. The same for the from step as well as the from step name, although the from step name we've written into a variable earlier, so we can just pass that variable directly to the column. Selected option, we go and check our gallery to see what is the selected record, and then fetch the option name from there. The two-step, as well as the responsible role and responsible person, all of these values we now want Flow to complete. So at this stage, PowerApps doesn't worry about any of that. It literally just saves the workflow history, and once Flow executes, it'll now go and populate these things based on your business rules and the roles and all of these fancy things that you can now set up in Flow. Then, sorry, there's one additional thing that is written by PowerApps. I actually just want to change that so it makes more sense. So that is the comment that the user might have specified at the time of hitting submit, and we just want to populate that in the workflow history as well. So for this, I'm just moving it so it makes a little bit more sense. So everything up to here is specified by PowerApps, and then these three steps or fields are populated by Flow. Alright, and then if that goes through, you want to call a reset trigger variable, and that allows, or that forces all of the controls to reset to the default state, so you don't end up with any things from this current record the next time you open up another record. And then we're clearing the top navigation. You don't need to worry about that too much, because we're using tabs in this form. We need to do that because these tabs might be dynamic. But then once all of these things are done, we're updating the context variable, submit in progress. It's saying it's false, and then we send the user off to the submission screen. And so in essence, this is everything that needs to happen on the workflow submit. Except for this mistake over here. When I moved this, I didn't move the correct field, so essentially I need to put a comma over there and then close that off. So that bracket closes the patch, and then we're returning the ID from this patch command, or the result from this patch, and we're setting the process stub record ID with that. For Flow, the way we're using Flow at the moment, where it's listening on the SharePoint list for the new records to be added, it doesn't really matter. But if we were using SQL on premises, Flow couldn't listen to the new data being added, and then we would have to pass this record to Flow, or this record ID to Flow, in order to initiate the Flow run. So this isn't actually necessary for the way we're doing it now, but it's might be a good idea to be aware of that. So let's jump back into PowerApps, and now let's run this. Let's complete this. So test 1, 2, 3, and we've got the submit request option selected, and let's hit submit. So all that this is now doing is it's updating the data and then writing the workflow history, and then what's it taking so long though? So then in essence we're getting back a reference number, and that means that submission has gone through successfully. So if we go back to the home screen, this will now refresh the data, and these are test 1, 2, 3, and you'll see that it's currently sitting with HR approval. So the flow run already kicked off and the submission was successful. So there's our record that we just submitted, and if we open that up, you'll see that it pulls through all the necessary information. If we close it and we open up the one underneath it, you'll see that it pulls through the correct information for this entry. So it resets those controls every time you open and close the form. And how is that done? So let's have a look at the onSelect formula for the gallery. And first of all, we are setting a context variable for record open in progress. And again, this is just to avoid a double click that users might open multiple records at the same time and then cause confusion in the formula. So we just disable the gallery as soon as this record is, or a record is being opened, we disable the gallery. Then we setting the form edit mode to false. We're setting the form underscore new variable to false as well, because it's not a new record. We're clicking on it in a gallery, so obviously it exists. We're now storing the selected record, the entire record, or rather a link to the record in the form record variable. Then we're saving the form record ID by connecting to the gallery and fetching the ID for that, and then it just makes it easier to access this going forward. Right, next we're connecting to the workflow history, and we're filtering the workflow history. We're filtering the workflow history by checking the record ID column and making sure that it's the same as the current record ID. And then we're writing all of those workflow history entries into the current record history collection. Next, we have to get the destination step ID from the last workflow history entry. And that's in order to determine in which step is this record currently based on the last submission. And we're populating this variable, the current record step ID, and then we're checking first of all if the history is blank, then that means that this record hasn't been submitted yet. So then we're just connecting to our workflow steps collection and we're fetching the first one, and then we're assuming that it is still in the first step because it hasn't been submitted yet. Then we're saying if it's blank, if the last record in the history entry has a two-step that is blank, it means that it was submitted into the process, but for whatever reason Flow couldn't finish running, or Flow couldn't connect to data source, or Flow crashed, or whatever the case may be, but the two-step hasn't been populated correctly. And then we just go and take the last record and we use the from step in that record. So that means that essentially the record is still in the last step that it was submitted from, because it was never actually submitted out of that step, if that makes sense. And then if none of these things are true, then we just go and connect to that current record history, and we fetch the two-step from that, and then we know that that is the step that this record is currently in. Now we go and filter our workflow steps with the step ID that we've just determined, and then we're writing that into a collection for current record step, and that's all of the properties for this record or for the step in the process, and then it's easy to interact with that. Right, then we take the current record step collection and we extract the step options and we write that into the current record options collection, and you'll see that these two collections are the same as what we use on a new record. So all of the controls on the screen just behave according to the current record step, exactly the same way as it did for a new record. So that's pretty cool. Right, now we're setting the current record step name, and we're just going fetching that, the current record step collection, and we're extracting the step name from that. And then now we have to specify or find out what the current record responsible person is. And here I found a bit of a shortcut. What I mean by that is in this demo there's actually an error. We never save the manager's name into the data record, and why I picked it up now is this formula is supposed to go and check if the current record history is blank, and if it is supposed to go and get the name of the manager or whoever submitted the first step of the or whoever created the record. It's supposed to go and fetch that guy's name. So typically we'll go and say connect to form record, and then go and fetch the manager or the requester or whoever was responsible for that first creation of the record. But I picked up that in our SharePoint list we're not storing that name at the moment in the demo. So if for whatever reason somebody creates a new record and just saves it without submitting it, it means that nobody will be able to open up that record, because it won't know who created it, and then we can't set this record to that on that person's name. So that, as a workaround, we're just setting this to the var current user ID. So if for whatever reason somebody saves this record in draft status without submitting it, anybody else will go and be able to go and open up that record. So this is a bit of a caveat to be aware of in this demo, but in a real life scenario you'll probably then write the manager or the requester's name in your data table, and then you can just access it from there. So if the current record history is not blank, then we can fetch that, just connect to that current record history, fetch the last entry, and then fetch responsible person name from there. And then essentially we are good to go. From here we navigate to the data screen, and then we reset the record open in progress to false. And this is what gives us this functionality. Alright, so let's open up one of our records, and next thing we're going to just discuss quickly is the modify button. So if I click on that, you'll see that it puts it in modify mode, and I can now submit this. And let's quickly have a look at that formula that handles the modify for us. So just click on that. Right, and what this basically is doing is comparing and checking if the current user is the same person as the responsible person variable, or if the form admin override is true. And if one of these things are true, then essentially it sets the form in edit mode. If it's not, it'll go and check if the current user is the manager of the person who is currently responsible for it. And again, if it is, then it'll put it in edit mode. So that we use for if somebody's not available or out of the office or whatever, we assume that somebody's manager can approve or action workflow steps on his or her behalf. And then if none of these things are true, then we're just calling the runtime messages, and we're passing a warning to basically say that only the responsible person or their manager is allowed to modify the record. And just one thing to take note of here is, from an if statement perspective, it feels like you could have checked these three things. So you could have checked, is it the current user, is the admin override enabled, and is this person the manager in the first part of the if. But what we're trying to do here is first check these things before you call the Office 365 users connector. So you don't want to call the Office 365 user connector if it's not necessary, and if any of these two is true, then you don't want to call the Office 365 connector unnecessarily, because it takes additional time, and then the user will sit and wait for it. So if you move the statement to the first part of the if, or the first condition of the if, then it causes an extra delay every time the user clicks on submit. So we can go ahead and collapse that formula, and essentially the next thing we're going to be discussing is the workflow history. So you'll see that on the icon over here, all that we essentially do is navigate to the workflow details screen, and that does this for us. And now it's going to fetch all of the workflow history for this entry. So if I put this screen in edit mode, so you'll see that, let's make this a little bit bigger. So the header is exactly the same, but at the bottom we've got a gallery that connects to our workflow steps collection, and that just visually displays the progress in these steps. or in the process, and then we're using a fill or template fill to just go and say if it finds the current step ID or this item step ID in the history, then connect to the template section and use one of those fills, otherwise use the positive fill. So that just gives you a bit of a progress bar, and underneath this is a very straightforward table where we're simply going and saying that it should display the workflow history, and it should filter the workflow history with wherever the record ID is, what the current record ID, and then it should sort it in a descending manner on the ID column, and that then gives you the workflow history. So if we go out of this, and so this is test 1, 2, 3, let's say we approve this, let's specify the name of the recruiter, submitting it into the process. Just want to get some more detail into the workflow history. So that looks fine, everything went well. There, Tanya Pitt is a responsible person, and I am the manager for response for Tanya, so that's why I can modify this request. So there you'll see there's my additional entry, and there it shows the from step, selected option, to step, all of this information in the workflow history. So that works fairly well. If there are any comments, then these will show up in the step comments column. So that concludes our video for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for the feedback you've been sending. We really appreciate it. If you want to take part in the initiative to release this template to the community, please get in contact with me using the details on my screen. And if you want to get access to the template in the meantime, please feel free to contact me as well. We'll gladly share this. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, and have a good day. Bye bye.